I remember every harsh syllable, every sneer, every tear I swallowed that night. It still plays in my mind like a film reel set on repeat. My mother-in-law's voice sliced the hushed, grieving air, right there in the parlor. My husband's casket hadn't even been lowered into the ground for a full day before she demanded that I leave her family's home. She stood at the threshold of the living room, overshadowed by my husband's large oil portrait on the mantel, a painting that I had commissioned for his last birthday. Her posture was stiff, shoulders trembling with either fury or some twisted sense of triumph. The black dress she wore might have signaled mourning for an outsider, but to me, it looked more like an executioner's robe. "Get out," she said, her voice scratchy from hours of shedding very performative tears. "You're not welcome in this house." I can still see the flicker of outrage behind her eyes, as though me simply existing in the same room was an affront to her dignity. She stared at me, her stare like a hawk bearing down on its prey. As for me, I felt numb from the inside out, lost in that surreal post-funeral haze where everything moves in slow motion. What my dear mother-in-law didn't know, and what I hadn't planned on revealing until the moment was right, was that the estate she believed she controlled was, in fact, now under my authority. The house, the properties, my late husband's investments, everything. And while she spat at me to leave, while the other family members watched in stunned silence, I held my tongue. Because in that moment of heartbreak and betrayal, I realized something crucial. I no longer had to prove anything to her. I had always hoped that one day we'd find common ground. Maybe she'd accept me if I tried a bit harder. Maybe she'd see that I truly loved her son. But that chance died along with him, and now she was baring her claws, determined to slice away the last piece of security I had. She thought my entire world revolved around being permitted to stay in her home. But the house was no longer hers. Not that night. Not ever again. There were secrets my husband and I had kept, mostly because we knew that if his mother caught wind of our legal arrangements, she'd unleash a storm of meddling that no one could quell. He was always gentle with me, always protective, and though his mother despised me from day one, he shielded me with quiet determination. So while I clutched the edges of my black funeral dress, trembling with heartbreak at my husband's loss, I also felt a strange peace. I had a power she couldn't yet fathom. That power would reveal itself soon enough. I first met William's mother on a rainy afternoon 6 years ago. My late husband, William Lockwood, was a man of few words but enormous generosity. We met at a small charity event for underprivileged youth in our city. He introduced himself, shyly adding that he was the founder of the scholarship fund we were all celebrating that night. I was volunteering as an event coordinator, and though he was obviously well-heeled, he arrived in a chauffeured town car, he never boasted about his wealth. It was only weeks later, after a few dates, that I even learned about the grand Lockwood estate. William insisted it was no big deal. "Just an old family house," he'd said with a dismissive wave, as if it were a quaint little cottage. But to me, it felt like stepping into a storybook. High ceilings, marble floors, antique tapestries, rows of centuries-old portraits. It was a sprawling mansion, the Lockwood family's pride since the early 1900s. On our third date, William tentatively asked if I would mind meeting his mother. He seemed hesitant, as though he knew she might not welcome me with open arms. At the time, I thought, how bad can it be? She's probably just protective. Perhaps that explained why William, who was already in his early 30s, had never introduced a girlfriend to his family before, or at least, that's what he told me. When I arrived at the estate, the butler, a kindly older gentleman named Emmett, escorted me through a polished foyer. The echoes of my heels clicking against the marble made me feel self-conscious. I wore a simple white sundress that day, hoping not to seem too flashy or too plain. My heart was hammering. I still remember the lemony scent of the polish used on the banister. We found William's mother, Margaret Lockwood, in her favorite sitting room, an ornate space brimming with antique furniture and dusty old books. She was sipping tea and peering out of the large bay window. She turned when she heard us approach, scanning me with the dispassionate gaze of someone evaluating a new hire. "You must be Claire," she said, setting down her teacup. Her lips barely moved, and though she extended a hand, she did so with the air of a queen bestowing a favor on a commoner. I tried to introduce myself politely. My voice quivered, but I mustered my best smile. "Yes, Mrs. Lockwood, I'm Claire. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for—" She interrupted me. "You're the event coordinator, right? The charity volunteer?" "Yes," I replied, caught off guard. "I work full-time in nonprofit management, but I volunteer with multiple—" She swept her gaze over me, lingering on my shoes as though they were a matter of deep suspicion. "I see. So you and my son met at one of these gatherings he throws money at." In that moment, I caught the faint sneer. And from that moment on, it never entirely disappeared. That was the beginning of my relationship with my future mother-in-law. William tried to break the tension. He stepped forward, gently pressing a hand against my back. "Mother, Claire has done some incredible work in the community. I'm sure she has," Margaret Lockwood said pointedly, "and I'm sure she'll continue to do so. It's admirable work indeed." But her tone told me everything. My charity work, to her, was only slightly more respectable than panhandling. At best, it was a quaint pastime. At worst, it was a sign that I did not belong in the lofty corridors of the Lockwood name. Still, I held out hope. During that very first tea, I politely engaged her about the family's philanthropic endeavors, how it was wonderful that they had supported so many educational programs. Margaret answered in clipped sentences, occasionally giving her son disapproving glances, disapproving that he'd even let me speak, or so it seemed. But William was good at pivoting conversations. He shielded me from her barbed remarks by steering the talk to safer topics like old family stories or memories from his father, who had passed away many years ago. Toward the end of the visit, though, she leveled a direct question. "Claire, dear, your parents, what do they do?" I explained that my father had passed away when I was young, and my mother was a retired schoolteacher living out of state. Margaret's expression remained unreadable, but I felt her silent judgment. I lacked the pedigree, the expansive generational ties, the interwoven network of important names that she valued. Once we left, William apologized the entire drive to my apartment. "She's not always like that," he insisted. "She's just protective. You're the first woman I've brought home since, well, in a long time." I nodded, heart sinking. I knew protective was a euphemism for controlling, and my gut told me that I would be an outsider in her eyes for the foreseeable future. Despite his mother's chilly reception, William and I grew close. We spent every free minute together. He began telling me more about his childhood, a lonely existence overshadowed by old money expectations. His father, who had died of a heart attack when William was 16, was apparently the kinder parent, more open-minded. Margaret, on the other hand, was the caretaker of the Lockwood legacy. "She's never had to worry about money a day in her life," William said once, "which is precisely why she feels the need to guard it so viciously." We dated for a year and a half. During that time, Margaret's demeanor did not improve. In fact, as rumors of an engagement circulated among the social circles, it got worse. Polite indifference turned into curt hostility. She rarely spoke to me directly at parties. If we had family gatherings, she'd cast me looks that told me I was still just a guest on her property. When William proposed, on a quiet evening at my apartment, he did so with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes. He told me, "I love you, Claire. No matter what Mother says or does, I want to build a life with you." I said yes, my heart bursting. For me, that moment was absolute, pure bliss. For William, it was partly overshadowed by the knowledge of the war that would await us once his mother heard the news. We broke the engagement news to Margaret together, at the estate around Christmas time. She'd set out spiced cookies and mulled wine. The entire house was draped in holiday finery, glittering trees, poinsettias in every corner. And in that festive setting, William announced we were engaged. Margaret went stone still. She set her teacup down more forcefully than necessary, the porcelain clinking. "I assume you've considered the ramifications of your decision," she said, leveling a glare at me before looking back to William. "You'll be bringing a volunteer coordinator into the Lockwood family. The local tabloids will make it look like you married beneath you." "Mother," he hissed, "Claire is not beneath me, and I don't care about any local tabloids. This is my life." She forced a tight smile. "Yes, well, we all make our choices." She refused to help plan the wedding. Not a dime of support. Not a suggestion about flowers or dresses. If anyone asked her, she claimed, "I'm simply letting my son do what he wants. He'll learn soon enough." And so, on a sunny spring afternoon, William and I married without her presence. She declined to show at the ceremony, claiming she had urgent business out of state. In truth, we knew it was her protest against a marriage she considered unfit. William masked his heartbreak with stoicism as I walked down the aisle in a small private garden. Only 60 guests attended, mostly my friends, plus a handful of family members I still had contact with. None of the esteemed Lockwood social circle appeared that day. No massive display of wealth, no swanky after-party. It was intimate, heartfelt, and ours. We spent our honeymoon in Italy, exploring Rome, Florence, and a tiny countryside villa William had visited once as a teenager. For 2 weeks, it was just us, savoring new beginnings. But in the back of our minds, we knew real life awaited us the moment we returned. And part of that real life was dealing with Margaret Lockwood. Although Margaret called it her house, the legal truth was that the estate was already in William's name. Before his father died, it had been placed in a family trust, with William as the primary heir. However, in practice, Margaret was the matriarch in residence. William, uncomfortable with conflict, had simply let her run the place as she always had. She managed staff, organized the finances, handled day-to-day affairs. My husband seldom challenged her, focusing instead on his own philanthropic and business interests. When we returned from the honeymoon, William told me, "I want you to move in. Mother will just have to deal with it." "Are you sure that's wise?" I asked. "We could find our own place." But he insisted. "We can't run forever. The estate is big enough for us to have privacy. Besides, I don't want her to think she can scare you away. Perhaps if we had chosen a separate residence, life might have been easier." But William was determined to stand firm, to assert the rightful place of his new wife. And so I moved into the Lockwood estate. The first weeks were tense. Margaret made a show of ignoring me in the halls. She continued to manage the estate staff as if I were invisible. If I tried to help plan a dinner party, she'd override every decision or claim that we always do it this other way. If I asked the gardeners about new landscaping ideas, she'd scold them for even listening to me. One day, Emmett the butler found me in the library, near tears, after I'd overheard Margaret telling a distant relative on the phone that William's new wife doesn't belong here. She's a gold digger who snatched up the Lockwood name. Emmett spoke softly, reminding me that Mrs. Lockwood had always been this controlling even when her husband was alive. He tried to assure me that the staff respected me, even if Margaret didn't. My nights were my solace. William would hold me, whispering that we'd build a life so strong that no one, not even his overbearing mother, could tear it down. Eventually, we carved out our own routines. Some days Margaret was downright hostile. Other days she was simply cold. Rarely, on a good day, she would speak to me as if I were a mild acquaintance. Never warmly, never with actual acceptance, but with a forced civility. That was the best I could hope for. 2 years passed in that uneasy dynamic, with Margaret's disapproval always hovering like a storm cloud. Then came the news that shook our world. William fell ill. It started with unexplained exhaustion and fevers. We visited specialists, had test after test. I watched him lose weight, his cheeks grow hollow. Eventually, we got the diagnosis. It was advanced lymphoma. When we first received the news, Margaret wept, truly wept. It was the first time in years I saw her facade crack. Her only son. She hovered around him, demanded the best treatments, the finest doctors. For a fleeting moment, I thought tragedy might unite us. We both wanted William to be well, to fight this disease. For a while we stood side by side in waiting rooms, anxious and fearful together, but it didn't last. As his condition worsened, Margaret found a new outlet for her hostility. Me. She needed someone to blame. She'd snap if I gave him certain foods, claiming I was ignorant of his dietary needs. She'd accuse me of distracting him from focusing on rest. If William was too tired to see visitors, she'd claim I was isolating him from his friends. Sometimes I even found her rummaging through our bedroom, no explanation given. Through it all, William tried to keep the peace. Despite the pain, the medications, the uncertainty of remission, he told me every night, "I love you, thank you for staying." And of course I stayed. Nothing could tear me from his side. Over the course of many months, as we rode the roller coaster of remission scares and hopeful test results, William began to make certain legal arrangements. He pulled me aside one evening after Margaret had gone to bed, leading me to the quiet second-floor study that used to be his father's office. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a worn leather armchair near the fireplace. I complied, confusion swirling. "What is it?" He inhaled, wincing slightly at the pain in his chest. "If something happens to me, Claire, I can't leave you in the crosshairs of Mother's anger. I want you to be safe, taken care of, not only financially but in terms of your autonomy. I don't want her to run you out of here." I blinked back tears. "Don't talk like that, William. You're gonna get better." "Just in case," he insisted softly. "Humor me. I have a new will. The estate is already mine legally, but Mother thinks it belongs to her because she's lived here so long. If I pass, the entire property, the funds, the trust, it all goes to you." "Me?" I whispered, stunned. "What about your mother?" "She'll receive her monthly stipend from the family trust, but the controlling interest who decides if she gets to live here, how finances are managed, that goes to you." He took a shaky breath. "Otherwise, she'll tear you apart the moment I'm gone. But if you own everything, it levels the playing field." I wanted to protest, to say that none of that mattered so long as he got better. But deep down, I knew William was right. Margaret's hatred had only sharpened over the years. If he weren't around to shield me, she'd probably find a way to evict me immediately. So I signed the documents with him, tears dripping onto the pages. He signed them too, with the help of a lawyer who quietly visited the estate, ensuring everything was done properly. We stored them in a secure deposit box. The only ones who knew the details were William, me, the lawyer, and a notary who was sworn to confidentiality. Over the next several months, William's condition improved slightly. We dared to hope for remission. Margaret, in her own twisted way, also believed he'd pull through. She could not fathom losing her only child. If she suspected anything about the will, she never let on. She simply hovered, continuing her usual attempts to undercut my role in his life. Then, as often happens with advanced cancer, the disease returned with a vicious vengeance. William was hospitalized. Margaret and I spent countless nights by his bedside. There were days when we thought he'd rally, and others when doctors gently warned us to prepare for the worst. Finally, heartbreakingly, the worst came. He died on a brisk winter morning, the sun just barely peeking through the hospital window. I held his hand, numb with grief, as Margaret stood at the foot of the bed, trembling with silent rage at the universe that had taken her son away. Margaret insisted on a grand funeral that matched the Lockwood family name, public, lavish, showcasing all the trappings of wealth. She said it was to honor my son properly. Perhaps there was sincerity there. But it also felt like a production, an attempt to maintain the family's social standing in the face of tragedy. I was too numb to argue. I just wanted to bury my husband with dignity. The day of the funeral, dozens of black cars lined the estate's driveway. People poured into the family chapel on the property. Margaret wore a black veil, receiving condolences from her society friends. I tried to keep my composure through the eulogy, speaking words of love about William. My voice cracked multiple times. Tears blurred my vision, but I also felt Margaret's stare drilling into my back as if I had no right to speak at all. After the burial, we returned to the estate for a somber reception. Friends and distant family drifted from room to room, offering condolences, nibbling on catered finger foods. I accepted each handshake and hug with a forced half-smile, still in shock. The confrontation came later, after most of the guests had left or gone upstairs to the guest rooms. I was alone in the main parlor, which held so many memories. William teaching me to waltz on the polished floor, a few Christmas gatherings with minimal tension, nights reading by the fire. Now it felt hollow, haunted by his absence. Margaret entered, her black veil flipped back, revealing her reddened eyes. She approached me slowly, like a predator gauging the best angle of attack. "Claire," she said, voice wavering, "I need to speak with you about the future, your future." I felt a ball of dread form in my stomach. I swallowed, trying to remain polite. "Yes?" She took a breath, her posture rigid. "You can't stay here." It was so blunt that for a moment, I thought I misheard. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me," she continued, face twisting in contempt. "William is gone. This is Lockwood property. Lockwood family property. You have no right to keep living here, parading around as some widow of consequence. You and my son were married a short few years. Let's not pretend you earned any real status." Her words slapped me in the face. Disbelief mingled with raw grief. The man I loved was barely in the ground, and she was evicting me. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let her see me crumble. "You want me gone," I echoed, voice quivering. "Is that it?" She lifted her chin, her expression cold. "Yes. Out by tomorrow morning, or tonight if you can manage it. I'll have the staff pack up your things. I don't care where you go, as long as it's far from here." She turned sharply as if to leave, but I found my voice. Some last shred of self-respect made me speak. "Mrs. Lockwood," I said, my tone surprisingly calm. "I realize you're in pain. We both are. But this is low, even for you." She pivoted back, lips thinning. "Don't you dare speak to me like that. You have no idea how I feel. You never understood William the way I did. You were just a phase." Her words were vile, but I felt an undercurrent of something else. Was it jealousy? Resentment that her son cherished me, that I had a place in his heart she could never control? Emmett walked in at that moment, perhaps drawn by the raised voices. He looked stricken. "Madam," he addressed Margaret in a cautious tone, "there are still a few guests in the side hall. Shall I?" "See that she gathers her things," Margaret snapped, pointing at me. "I want her gone tonight." Then, with a swirl of black fabric, she stormed out, leaving me and Emmett alone. The old butler looked devastated. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Clare. I never imagined she'd act so immediately." I forced a small, sad smile. "It's okay, Emmett. Thank you. I know she can be difficult." I took a few moments to collect myself, letting the wave of shock and fury pass. But a quiet part of me remembered the carefully prepared legal documents. My departure, if it even happened, wouldn't last long. And once the reading of the will took place, Margaret's entire notion of who held the power would shift dramatically. By tradition, the family lawyer arranged to read William's will 1 week after the funeral. In that week, I stayed in a hotel downtown, largely to avoid physical conflict with Margaret. She told everyone who asked that Claire decided it was best to depart the estate. "She doesn't belong here anyway." I didn't correct her. Let her have her illusions for now. Truthfully, I spent those nights in tears, missing William's voice, his warm embrace, the gentle smile he'd give whenever I felt distressed. But I also found solace in the knowledge that he had protected me with his final act. The day after the funeral, my lawyer confirmed that the copy of William's will in the deposit box was indeed the final, most recent version. So on that fateful afternoon, I arrived at the Lockwood Estate's expansive drawing room. A heavy gloom hung in the air. Margaret was there, along with a few of William's distant cousins, and an aunt. They looked at me with curiosity or faint disdain. Emmett offered me a subtle nod, as if to say, "Be strong." The family lawyer, Mr. Robertson, stood at the head of the long oak table. He cleared his throat and began, "Thank you all for attending. We're gathered to discuss the last will and testament of Mr. William Lockwood. I will now read the relevant sections." For the first few minutes, it was the standard legal formalities. An introduction, statements about debts or obligations, minor bequests to charities. I felt my heart pound, anticipating the pivotal moment, and then it came. "I do hereby bequeath the entirety of my controlling interest in the Lockwood estate, including but not limited to the house, lands, investments, and associated trust assets, to my beloved wife, Claire Lockwood, née Sinclair. This includes all decision-making authority regarding occupancy, maintenance, and financial management of said estate." Silence roared through the room. You could have heard a pin drop. Margaret's face went from smugness to open-mouthed shock. She looked as if someone had just slapped her. Her eyes darted between me and Mr. Robertson in wild disbelief. Mr. Robertson cleared his throat again. Further, Mr. Lockwood stipulated that his mother, Margaret Lockwood, shall continue receiving a monthly stipend from the Lockwood Family Trust. However, the authority to grant or deny her residence on the property rests solely with Mrs. Claire Lockwood. Margaret gasped, That's impossible. He wouldn't. This must be a forgery, a mistake." Her voice trembled, but Mr. Robertson shook his head. "I have reviewed the documents thoroughly, Mrs. Lockwood. They are legitimate. William's signature was notarized, and I handled the paperwork myself." I kept my face neutral, though my pulse hammered with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a twinge of vindication. I felt no joy at her shock, only a quiet sense of finality. My husband's last act was to ensure my security. The reading concluded with details about smaller bequests to William's cousins and instructions for philanthropic donations. Margaret looked ashen, the color drained from her cheeks. As soon as Mr. Robertson closed the folder, she erupted. "This is a conspiracy," she spat. "That woman manipulated my son. She was never part of this family, and now you're telling me she owns everything. No, I won't stand for it." She whirled on me, eyes blazing. "How dare you do this behind my back? How dare you steal what's rightfully mine?" I rose, hands trembling. I looked at her with all the calm I could muster. "I did nothing. William chose this arrangement because he knew your hostility. If you wish to blame someone, blame your son, rest his soul." She glared, tears forming. "You turned him against me. I always knew you were after our wealth." Shame, rage, sorrow, all twisted inside me. But I kept my voice level. "Believe what you want. I never asked for a dime of his money. All I wanted was for you to respect me. You never did." Margaret's voice cracked. "This is my home. I was here first. You can't force me out." I recalled how she'd tried to force me out barely a week ago, literally the night of William's funeral. Part of me burned for retribution. But I also remembered William's last words. "Don't let her tear you apart. You hold the cards. You decide how this plays out." "Mrs. Lockwood," I said, turning formal, "I'm not going to make any rash decisions. For now, you may stay in the estate if you choose, assuming you can abide by certain conditions of respect, but you will no longer control the staff or the finances. That's for me to decide." Her eyes widened, face contorted in fury. "You can't do this." "I can," I said softly, "because this is now my estate." A few days later, I officially moved back into the house. I think Margaret fully expected me to barge in and reorder the staff, throw her out of the master suite she had commandeered after William's death, and humiliate her. Instead, I arrived quietly with my lawyer, verifying inventory and estate accounts. Emmett welcomed me with a relieved expression. The staff members seemed cautiously optimistic. The majority had never liked Margaret's iron rule. Margaret retreated to her private rooms, refusing to speak to me. I let her be. In those initial weeks, I was too consumed with my own grief to revel in any sense of triumph. I spent hours wandering the halls, passing the spots where William and I had laughed, danced, or read together. The sadness was immense. Owning the estate didn't ease the ache of losing him. But practicalities required my attention. Through the estate's financial documents, I discovered that Margaret had been spending lavishly for years, hosting elaborate luncheons, throwing expensive parties, redecorating rooms with overpriced antiques. Though the trust fund was substantial, if her extravagance continued unchecked, the money might dwindle in a matter of decades. I also found a letter from William's father, old and yellowed, expressing concerns about Margaret's spending addiction and how it might jeopardize the estate's longevity. William had never shown me this letter. Perhaps he hadn't wanted me to see how deep the problem ran. Yet, ironically, Margaret flung accusations that I was the gold digger. After about a month of quiet tension, she finally confronted me again. I was sipping tea one morning on the back terrace, overlooking the rose gardens that I planned to refurbish in William's memory. She marched out, black satin robe trailing behind her, eyes full of indignation. "This is absurd," she declared, voice cold. "The staff acts like you're in charge. They come to you with every question. They even told me I had to clear events with you. How dare they?" I gently set my teacup down. "Because, Margaret, I am in charge of the estate now, as per William's final wishes. If you want to host any gatherings, you do need to coordinate with me. It's a matter of record-keeping and budgeting." "Budgeting," she repeated, disgust dripping from the word. "Since when does the Lockwood family budget?" "Always, if they hope to remain financially secure," I replied evenly. "Look, I'm not forbidding you from having your social gatherings. But from now on, you can't just sign blank checks and expect the estate to cover it without oversight." She clutched her robe tighter, as if physically repulsed. "You can't seriously intend to micromanage my life, Claire. You've already stolen my home." Anger flared in my chest, but I kept my tone measured. "I didn't steal anything. Your son gave me this responsibility, likely because he knew how you'd handle it otherwise." And as for micromanaging, trust me, I have no desire to watch your every move. I'd just like to ensure the estate remains solvent." She scoffed. "You have the nerve to talk to me about solvency. You come from nothing. Of course you care about trivial matters like budgets." I took a deep breath. "Yes, I come from modest means, Margaret, and I'm not ashamed of that. If you want to keep living in this grand estate, it's going to require some changes in how we manage finances. If you can't accept that—" She cut me off, voice trembling with rage. "Oh, I can accept it. For now. But don't think this arrangement will last. I'll find a way to overturn that will. Mark my words." She pivoted on her heel, robes swishing against the tiled floor, and marched back inside. True to her word, Margaret filed a lawsuit within weeks, challenging the validity of William's will. She alleged undue influence and mental incompetence, claiming that I coerced William in his final days. The lawsuit blindsided me with its ferocity. But my lawyer, who had watched us prepare those estate documents carefully, reassured me. "She has no credible evidence. We have the doctor's statements verifying William was of sound mind when he signed. He had a notary present, plus your separate witnesses. The courts rarely overturn a will without substantial proof." Still, it was stressful. A court date loomed. The depositions were grueling. Margaret's lawyer tried to pick apart every detail, insinuating that I was a manipulative vixen who preyed on a dying man. I cried more than once after those sessions, outraged at the cruelty. Emmett and the staff stepped up as witnesses on my behalf, attesting to the fact that William had been planning these arrangements for months and that our relationship had always been genuine. My mother-in-law seethed at their testimonies. In the end, the judge dismissed the case. Margaret's evidence was scant, and the documentation supporting William's final will was watertight. The day we got that ruling, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. She had played her last legal card and lost. But Margaret's defeat in court only fueled her bitterness at home. She stayed in her wing of the estate, rarely emerging except to glare at me in passing. Sometimes I wondered if I should just ask her to leave, once and for all. But I thought about William, about how he might have wanted me to show compassion, even toward the woman who despised me. Strangely, about 6 months after we settled the legal battles, there was a brief period when Margaret's hostility seemed to wane. She fell ill with pneumonia, and the doctors advised bed rest. The staff, while still under my direction, gave her the best care possible. I visited her room once, timidly asking if she needed anything. She was pale, frail, no longer the formidable figure. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something human in her eyes, maybe gratitude or the ghost of regret. She didn't lash out, she just turned her head away, murmuring, "I'm fine," but her voice lacked its usual venom. I quietly arranged for a home nurse, covered all her medical expenses from the estate's funds, and made sure she had the medications she needed. Despite her past cruelty, I couldn't bring myself to treat her with the same coldness she showed me. William was gone, but I felt a moral duty not to stoop to her level. She recovered slowly. Eventually, the tension returned, though not quite as violently. It was like she had glimpsed her own mortality and was too exhausted to muster the same intensity of hatred. But our relationship remained distant, stiff, and polite at best. 2 years passed this way. I settled into a routine, overseeing estate renovations, continuing my nonprofit work, occasionally hosting modest charity events in the mansion's ballroom. Margaret mostly kept to her own circle of high society friends. She'd still call me names under her breath or block my efforts to modernize certain areas, but she no longer had the authority to override my decisions. I might have continued living like that indefinitely, tense but bearable, had it not been for a final blow-up that changed everything. It began with a discussion about renting out part of the estate grounds for a summer arts festival. A local nonprofit group approached me, excited to hold a series of open-air concerts and artisan fairs on the sprawling lawns. It was a perfect philanthropic tie-in, right up my alley. I would handle the logistics, ensuring the property was treated with respect. In return, the Lockwood Estate name would be promoted as a cultural hub. When Margaret heard about the plan, she went ballistic. She stormed into my office, previously William's father's study, one afternoon, face flushed with anger. "You will not degrade our heritage by letting random people trample over our grounds," she snarled. "Absolutely not." Trying to keep calm, I explained that the festival was curated, ticketed, and respectful. The organization had a proven track record. It would also bring positive publicity to the estate. Publicity from peasants, she snapped. Lockwood Estate does not whore itself out for nonsense like that. We are a private, exclusive family, not a circus venue. I stared at her, my chest tight with anger. That's an incredibly offensive way to refer to people. And let's be clear, this is my final decision to make, not yours. She pounded her fist on the desk, scattering a pile of documents. This has gone on long enough. I've tried to tolerate your meddling, your infiltration of my home, but this is too far. Hosting fairs and festivals on Lockwood grounds, you might as well burn down the family legacy. There it was. Her venom, her sense of entitlement. I realized then that she would never change. She would never see me as anything but an intruder. Compassion or not, William's final will or not, nothing would appease her. I stood up, leveling my gaze at her. Margaret, if you can't handle the evolution of this estate, perhaps it's time you found a new place to live. You've made it clear for years that you consider me beneath you, and you can't stand the way I manage things, so maybe it's best you go. Her eyes bulged, as if she couldn't believe her ears. You want me to leave my own home? I tried to remain composed, though my voice quivered. This home isn't yours. We established that. It's mine now. And I've been patient. Far more patient than you ever were with me. But if all you can do is poison every effort I make, insult the charitable work I do, and belittle the people I bring here, perhaps you should consider your alternatives. She stared, speechless for once. After a long, tension-filled moment, she let out a bitter laugh. So that's how it is. You pretend to be kind, but you're just waiting to throw me out on the street. I hesitated, memories flickering of how she tried to kick me out the night of William's funeral. Perhaps a part of me had wanted this outcome for a while. But it wasn't about revenge. It was about peace. My peace, which she threatened daily. If you can't live here under my terms, I said softly, then yes, you may have to leave. I can ensure you have a comfortable place in one of the trust's other properties, or an apartment in the city if you prefer. But I won't keep letting you sabotage everything I do. She squared her shoulders, tears of rage glistening in her eyes. Don't bother with your so-called generosity. If I leave on my own terms. You think you can do this, all because of some technicality in the will? I'll show you. I'll show everyone what a vile woman you really are. She stormed out, and for days I heard nothing more. She neither appeared at meals nor answered the door when staff came by. I was half convinced she was plotting another lawsuit or some scandalous scheme. But then, unexpectedly, Emmett informed me that a moving company had arrived early one morning. Margaret was packing her belongings in discreet haste. I watched from my bedroom window as the movers took out crates labeled with her initials, ML. Over the next few hours, they loaded a series of steamer trunks and garment bags into 2 large trucks. Margaret, dressed in a sober black suit, supervised from a distance, her posture rigid. Eventually, she stepped into a waiting car. The engine started, but before it pulled away, she rolled down the window. She gazed up at the house with a haunted expression, as if she were seeing ghosts in every window. For a split second, I thought I saw sorrow in her eyes, maybe a reflection of the decades she'd spent here, the memories of her husband and her son. Then, the car rumbled down the driveway, disappearing through the wrought iron gates. That was how Margaret Lockwood left. No grand tantrum, no final screaming match. Just a quiet, bitter departure. Life at the estate changed overnight. The staff breathed easier. I proceeded with the Summer Arts Festival plan. The event turned into a beautiful success, raising thousands of dollars for local arts education. People began to see the Lockwood Estate as a place of community enrichment, not just an isolated fortress of old money. Still, I had complicated emotions. There were nights I couldn't sleep, remembering how my mother-in-law's departure mirrored her old threat. She had once told me to leave with barely an hour's notice. Now it was she who left, because I demanded a basic level of respect she was incapable of giving. In some sense, I felt guilty, as if I'd stooped to her level. But then I reminded myself. The difference was that I never wanted her out of the house. Not until she left me no choice. The estate was big enough for both of us, if only she could have coexisted without animosity. She'd refused any path other than conflict, and so this was the outcome. A month later, I received a letter. It arrived via registered mail, addressed to me in an elegant script I recognized as Margaret's. Inside was a single piece of stationery. The letter read, "Claire, you may tell yourself I left because you forced me out, or because I couldn't abide your modern changes. But there's more to it than that. I can't bear the memories in that house anymore. Everywhere I go, I see William, my son, taken from me too soon. I see him dancing with you, laughing with you, ignoring me. He was the last piece of family I had in this world. Now he's gone, and you remain. Take the estate. Use it however you wish. For me, it's just a reminder of what I lost. May we never see each other again. Margaret Lockwood." I sat there, tears slipping down my cheeks. Even in her final words, she hurled blame. Yet I could sense the raw grief that fueled her cruelty. We were two grieving women who had never found a way to bridge the gap between us. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. That same day, I visited William's memorial in the rose garden. The newly planted buds were blossoming in soft pink and white. I spoke aloud as if he could hear me. "William, I'm sorry for everything. I love you. I hope you understand I did my best. I hope your mother finds some peace wherever she's gone." The wind rustled the rose bushes. Perhaps it was a sign of comfort, or just nature's gentle breath. But I felt a sense of release, as though the final page of a bitter chapter had been turned. Over the following year, I continued to transform the Lockwood estate from a symbol of rigid old-world exclusivity into a place that actively engaged with the community. I opened the gardens for tours on weekends, donating the proceeds to local nonprofits. I turned one of the unused wings into a small art gallery featuring emerging local artists. The house was no longer a mausoleum of the Lockwood family's insular traditions. It was alive with visitors and creativity. The staff thrived under a more cooperative environment. Emmett, who had served the family for decades, confided in me one day, "Mrs. Clare, I believe this is what Mr. William would have wanted. To see his home filled with happiness instead of tension." Margaret never returned. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to a smaller ancestral property 2 states away, rarely hosting events, living quietly with the remnants of her own illusions. Part of me wondered if she regretted her actions, but I didn't pry. Some distances are best left intact for the sake of everyone's peace. At times, I felt a pang of sadness, a longing for what might have been if she had welcomed me into her family from the start. If we had joined forces to honor William's memory, we might have built something beautiful together. But that hope was a relic of the past, like a faded photograph of a life never lived. 2 years after Margaret's departure, the estate hosted a large garden gala that raised funds for cancer research. I wore a flowing green gown, reminiscent of the color William loved best on me. Speeches were made about the importance of philanthropy, and guests walked through the grand hall, marveling at the estate's revitalized energy. Standing at the microphone, I welcomed everyone, my voice carrying across the rose garden. I spoke about William, his legacy of kindness, and how the estate now served as a beacon of community support. As I glanced over the crowd, I caught glimpses of grateful faces: volunteers, cancer survivors, local artists. They were all part of a living legacy that honored the best of William's spirit. In that moment, I also acknowledged an unspoken truth. Margaret's attempt to cast me out had fueled a transformation far greater than either of us could have imagined. Had she not challenged me so fiercely, I might have stayed silent, deferring to old conventions. Instead, I found my voice, recognized my worth, and stepped fully into the role William had entrusted me with. Later that night, after the gala ended, I strolled alone through the gardens under the moonlight. Crickets chirped. The air smelled of late summer blooms. I paused by William's memorial stone, where a single candle flickered. "Thank you," I whispered, placing a hand on the smooth marble. "I wish you were here to see it, but I hope wherever you are, you're smiling." A soft breeze caressed my hair. I closed my eyes, letting a gentle peace settle in my heart. Yes, it hurt that he was gone. Yes, it hurt that his mother's hatred had overshadowed so much of our marriage. But now, I stood in the estate he once called home, not as an interloper, but as a caretaker of his vision. And I would continue that mission with all the love I had. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regretted letting Margaret walk away instead of kicking her out immediately, if I ever wished I'd used my newfound power to humiliate her as she had tried to humiliate me. I always answer the same way: no. Because real revenge, if you can even call it that, lies in living well, carrying on William's memory with an estate brimming with compassion and purpose. The satisfaction, if any, comes from knowing she can no longer harm me or overshadow this place with her bitterness. She left of her own accord, and for all her threats, she ultimately had to face the reality of her lost control. I still think about Margaret from time to time, wondering if she ever found a measure of peace in her final years. I wonder if she ever realized that her crusade against me was ultimately a crusade against her own loneliness. But these reflections no longer hurt me. I've built a new life, full of philanthropic projects, community gatherings, and the knowledge that William's love underpins it all. The estate is mine to steward, to transform. And each day, as the morning sun spills across the antique floors, I remember. I was the daughter-in-law she never wanted, but ended up with anyway. And I was the one who held the estate keys in the end. That's how, barely hours after the funeral, my mother-in-law tried to banish me, only to discover too late that the will placed every last corner of this property under my authority. She had no idea that I controlled the entire estate. She wanted me out, but I emerged the rightful caretaker of the Lockwood legacy. Maybe it was destiny. Maybe it was William's final blessing. Or maybe it was simply the inescapable truth that love and kindness, when tested by malice, can become stronger than any fortress of wealth or tradition.